The past is not a place of rest, but a preparation for the future. That's Frederick Douglass.
Mm.
And it feels particularly relevant today, doesn't it? As we look at how societies grapple with the long shadow of disaster. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely. We're stepping into a really complex challenge today. It's born from, one specific event, but it has these universal themes: recovery, responsibility, the long-term impacts of our actions.
Absolutely. We're taking a deep dive today into this persistent, really challenging issue, managing contaminated soil in Fukushima, Japan. This is all following the devastating 2011 nuclear disaster.
And our insights for this discussion, they come from a recent report by CNA.
Right.
And, while it's rooted in Fukushima, this situation is such a critical case study. It helps us understand post-disaster environmental management, the sheer complexity of governmental and, societal challenges, too.
Yeah, and the human side of it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you happen to be following current affairs for something like, say, the UPSC exams, this is just a prime example. It really touches on environment, governance, public policy.
All of it.
How things actually get implemented or don't.
Right. And the core problem here, it really boils down to something born from necessity, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, to get radiation levels down after the meltdown, authorities had this massive cleanup. Part of that involves scraping away just vast amounts of topsoil.
A huge amount.
And now, years later, they're left with this immense quantity of contaminated dirt and this, incredibly difficult question: what's the permanent plan for all of it?
So let's maybe step back for a second. Why was this massive soil removal even necessary? It all traces back to that day, March 11, 2011, that incredibly powerful earthquake and the tsunami that followed, which of course triggered the meltdowns at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. And those releases contaminated the surrounding land.
Right. And the decontamination wasn't just scraping soil, though that was a huge part. The report mentions broader efforts, too, like blasting building surfaces, roads, trying to wash the radiation away.
Yeah, a multi-pronged approach. And the result of all that effort, most areas outside the immediate, the really tight exclusion zone, they have been declared safe for people to return.
Okay.
However, and this is key, the report notes that a large number of the original evacuees, they haven't actually gone back.
Why is that? Mainly lingering fears.
It varies. For some, yes, absolutely, lingering worries about radiation, even if levels are officially low. For others, it's been over a decade, they've simply rebuilt their lives elsewhere in Japan.
That makes complete sense. It's a long time. But there's also this kind of counterpoint in the sources, isn't there? A fascinating detail about the region today.
Oh, you mean about new residents?
Exactly. It is attracting new people. The report mentions a young guy, Takuya Haraguchi, he's 25, came to Fukushima to start a kiwi farm.
Right, I remember reading that.
And he's quoted saying he wants people to see what the prefecture is like now, sort of pushing back against that, that lingering image of it being a no-go zone.
It adds a layer of nuance, definitely. Shows that recovery isn't monolithic.
For sure. But that new life, it's happening right alongside this enormous, ongoing challenge of the soil itself. Because the amount of soil we're talking about, it's just staggering.
It really is. Staggering is the right word. The CNA report puts a number on it. 14 million cubic meters of contaminated soil.
14 million. It's hard to even grasp.
Well, to give some scale, the source points out, that's enough soil to fill more than 10 Major League Baseball stadiums.
10 baseball stadiums. Wow, just picture that, overflowing.
And all that material, right now, it's being held. It's stored in these large interim facilities located right there, relatively close to the Fukushima Daiichi plant itself.
Okay, so it's still local for now. But here's where a really significant political and social challenge comes in, right? The promise.
Yes, the government's promise. They made a very clear vow to the residents of Fukushima.
What was the core of it?
That this soil ultimately would find permanent storage elsewhere in the country, outside the prefecture.
Okay, so move it out completely.
Yes, with a target deadline of 2045.
2045. Still a ways off, but a clear commitment.
And it was, in part, an acknowledgement. The power from that plant, it primarily served Tokyo and the big urban centers, not so much the local community that suffered the immediate fallout.
Right. So a matter of fairness or trying to achieve it?
Sort of a redistribution of the burden, yeah. So how do you actually store 14 million cubic meters of potentially radioactive soil safely in the meantime?
Good question. What does the report say about the current setup?
It describes these huge mounds of soil contained within garden grounds. They use layers of clean soil on top.
Okay, capping it.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And crucially, a man-made sheet underneath acting as a barrier. The goal is to prevent any radioactive runoff from getting into the surrounding environment. It's a containment strategy, but an interim one.
Okay, so we understand why it was removed, roughly where it is now, and there's this big promise to move it eventually. What exactly is Japan's plan for the permanent fate of all this soil?
Right, the long-term strategy. The government's primary plan, as laid out in the report, is actually reuse.
Reuse?
The
How?
idea to use the less contaminated portions of this soil as fill material
Mm-hmm.
for public works projects, specifically things like road embankments, railway embankments, that sort of thing, across the country.
Across the country. And they're still sticking to the idea that this reuse must happen outside of Fukushima Prefecture?
Yes, the report is clear on that. It ties right back to that promise, that idea of not further burdening the community that's already sacrificed so much.
Okay, so the plan is reuse outside Fukushima. Sounds logical, perhaps, but
But, and here's where the plan really runs into significant real-world difficulty. The report highlights that very few, if any, places outside Fukushima have actually agreed to accept this soil for these projects. Not yet, anyway.
ah, so the willingness just isn't there from other regions.
Apparently not. And that lack of willing takers outside the prefecture, it's leading to some pretty blunt local perspectives.
Mean.
The report mentions that some officials within Fukushima Prefecture are starting to believe that, realistically, some portion of this soil might just end up having to stay within Fukushima, despite the government's promise.
Wow. So a potential walking back of that commitment driven by practical reality.
It seems like a possibility they're having to confront. And adding another layer here, trying to build acceptance, the source notes a recent sort of symbolic action.
What's that?
The Prime Minister's office plans to recycle some of this soil for flower beds, right there.
Flower beds. Seriously.
Yeah. The intention seems pretty clear. Demonstrate its safety, try to normalize its use, maybe in visible everyday ways.
Okay, that flower bed example, it feels like it leads directly to the next crucial question, doesn't it? Just how safe is this soil? Especially if we're talking about using it in public infrastructure or even, well, flower beds. What does the data say?
Yeah, the safety question is paramount. The Environment Ministry, they provide some figures on this in the report. They state that roughly 75% of the stored soil has relatively low levels of radioactivity.
Okay, 75% is low level. A low compared to what?
They frame it in terms of exposure, specifically a level equivalent to or less than one chest X-ray per year for someone who might be standing right on it or, working near it.
One chest X-ray a year. Okay. And the technical approach to reusing even this soil, it still relies heavily on containment, right? It's not just dumping it.
Oh, absolutely. Akira Asakawa, an official from the Environment Ministry quoted in the report, explains this. The plan always involves sealing in the radioactivity, using layers of other material, things like asphalt, clean farm soil, other barriers, basically sandwiching the contaminated soil when it's used as fill.
I see. So it's about engineering controls.
Exactly. And the government has even run tests to try and demonstrate this works. According to the report, they've built actual roads and fields within Fukushima Prefecture using this treated contaminated soil as the base layer or filling material, kind of like pilot projects.
Okay, real-world tests. And what did those tests show, according to Asakawa in the source?
The results, they say, were positive. Those specific locations where the soil was used, they didn't show elevated radioactivity levels on the surface.
And crucially, what about runoff?
Also negative, apparently. No detectable runoff of radioactive material into the surrounding areas from those test sites.
Okay, so the government presents data suggesting safety, points to test results showing successful containment in practice, but the report also makes it very clear this is not being universally accepted. There's been significant public pushback.
Absolutely. Significant is the word. The report specifically highlights an incident back in 2022. Local communities reacted quite angrily to some initial government proposals.
Okay, what were those proposals? Where were they suggesting the soil be taken?
The plans involved bringing some of the Fukushima soil to, believe it or not, a popular park in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And other areas closer to the capital as well.
Wow, a park in Tokyo. I can imagine the reaction.
It was immediate, and it was strong. And as a direct result of that public outcry, the report indicates that specific plan just hasn't moved forward.
Stalled completely.
Seems like it. And despite what feels like, broad public sympathy across Japan for the people of Fukushima, actually securing alternative locations outside the prefecture for this soil, It's just proven incredibly difficult.
It really underscores that gap, doesn't it, between maybe a scientific assessment of risk and the public's perception or willingness to accept that risk.
It really does. And that brings us neatly to the Environment Ministry's next step, which is mentioned in the report, recognizing they need to bridge that gap.
What are they planning?
They plan to significantly step up their efforts, starting from this year, 2025, to explain the safety protocols, explain the whole plan to the public, try to build that trust.
So more public relations, more communication.
Essentially, yeah. It's a clear acknowledgement that, technical solutions on paper aren't enough. They need social buy-in. They need to build trust and understanding.
Okay. So pulling all these threads together, what does this incredibly complex situation in Fukushima really illustrate for us? It's obviously not just a technical problem of figuring out, where to put some dirt.
No, not at all. It's deeply, deeply human and societal, isn't it? It's about trust. Trust in government, trust in science. Often trust that was shattered by the initial disaster.
Right.
It's about governmental responsibility, historical accountability, and it's very much about this thorny issue of equitable burden sharing after a national crisis. Who bears the cost? Literally and figuratively, years down the line.
Yeah. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's such a stark reminder of the long-term environmental and social challenges that societies face in managing waste, especially just from these complex, powerful technologies like nuclear energy.
It raises fundamental questions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About planning for the entire life cycle of our energy sources. What are the unforeseen or maybe just inconvenient, long-lasting consequences we need to build into our thinking from the very start?
Absolutely. And for you listening, whether you're just tracking current events for general knowledge or maybe you're preparing for something specific like the UPSC exams, this is just such a powerful real-world case study.
It really is.
It highlights challenges in environmental policy implementation, the immense complexities of disaster management and long-term recovery.
Not just the immediate aftermath, but the decades after.
Exactly. Practical issues in public administration, governance, the difficult dynamics between central government and local authorities when you're trying to distribute burdens.
That central-local tension is huge here.
For everyone, really. It just shows the tangible human dimension behind our energy choices and the incredibly arduous path a community and a whole nation walks towards recovery.
Yeah, it moves way beyond abstract policy. It's about lived reality, people, places.
So just to quickly recap our deep dive today, based on that CNA report. Japan is grappling with this massive quantity, 14 million cubic meters of contaminated soil from the Fukushima cleanup.
Huge amount, currently held in temporary storage near the plant.
Right. And the government made this promise to move it all elsewhere permanently by 2045. The main plan is reuse in construction projects outside Fukushima.
But that plan faces major public resistance across the country, even though government tests suggest the soil can be safely contained.
And the clock is ticking, in a way. Storage space is limited. Finding willing locations is proving incredibly difficult.
Which raises the real question about whether some soil might, in the end, need to stay in Fukushima after all.
Yeah. Which leaves us with a really compelling, maybe unsettling question for you to consider as you reflect on all this.
And that question is, how do societies effectively navigate that difficult space? That space between, on one hand, scientific and technical assessments of safety.
Which might say, this is manageable, this is containable.
Right. And on the other hand, deeply ingrained public perception, historical trauma, memory, and the really complex issues of responsibility and shared burden after a major disaster. How do you bridge that gap?
A challenge with absolutely no easy answers. This deep dive was based on reporting from CNA. If you found this exploration valuable, thought-provoking, please do consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find the discussion.
And if you have any further questions or your own thoughts on this complex issue, we'd genuinely love to hear them. Just leave us a comment.
Yeah, your perspective really does add to the discussion. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.